The gate stays closed longer than it should. A line of travellers waits quietly beneath the torchlight while Roman guards question arrivals one by one, checking cargo, watching faces, and turning away anyone who appears unwell. You are living inside the moment when a crisis stops being temporary fear and starts becoming administrative control. You are about to see how plague, shortages, sanitation, military presence, and public ritual quietly tighten ancient Rome's grip on daily life until emergency power begins feeling completely normal. And if you enjoy calm, systems-driven history like this, you might find a good place here in the archive. The smell reaches the street before the decree does. Not every district at once, of course. Rome is too large for that. One neighborhood hears that a family has stopped opening their shutters. Another notices that a fish seller has not appeared near the forum for 3 mornings in a row. Someone farther uphill watches smoke rising from hurried household burnings where bedding, clothing, and scraps of furniture are being destroyed because nobody wants them inside the house anymore. At first, nothing official changes. The baker still opens his stall before sunrise. Porters still drag grain sacks through narrow streets slick with old rainwater and mule waste. Tax collectors still expect payment, and water still runs through the public fountains. The city continues its routines because large cities always continue their routines. Rome is built on repetition and depends on it. Still, the pace changes slightly. People begin leaving more space between themselves in crowded streets, though nobody calls it distancing because that language does not exist yet. The behavior does. A man coughing near a bread queue suddenly finds himself standing alone without entirely understanding why. Bathhouses remain open, but people start watching the water differently. Steam no longer feels entirely relaxing once rumor settles into the city like damp weather. You're not watching medical science emerge here. You're watching social instinct become structure. Rome does not understand disease in modern terms. Physicians debate air quality, moisture, divine displeasure, contaminated environments, and imbalance within the body. Some explanations are practical. Others sound like men attempting to explain weather using philosophy and confidence alone. Still, the exact cause matters less than the visible effect. The city believes something dangerous is moving through crowded human spaces, and that alone is enough to alter behavior. This is where authority quietly expands, not because Rome suddenly becomes tyrannical overnight. That would almost be simpler. Instead, ordinary people begin looking toward officials for coordination because uncertainty is exhausting. Human beings tolerate confusion poorly for extended periods of time. Someone eventually has to decide whether markets stay open, whether ships unload at harbor, whether grain caravans continue moving, whether funerals become restricted, and whether soldiers remain at their posts or move closer to population centers. The average citizen cannot answer those questions individually because the city requires synchronized behavior. Rome survives because millions of separate actions are pushed into organized patterns, and crisis increases the value of organization. A magistrate walking through the forum during stable times is merely another official in dyed trim and polished sandals. During a crisis, the same figure becomes a source of certainty. Even incomplete certainty has value. People generally prefer flawed structure over drifting confusion. History repeatedly demonstrates this unpleasant little feature of human civilization. You begin seeing more clerks carrying tablets through public areas. Notices appear faster. Couriers move between administrative buildings more frequently. Harbour officials begin receiving additional instructions regarding incoming vessels, while local ward leaders quietly communicate with higher authorities about deaths, shortages, disturbances, and labour disruptions. The system starts measuring itself more aggressively. Rome already tracks grain supply, taxation, military movement, and population distribution during ordinary periods, but a crisis increases the urgency of information flow. Administrators need numbers constantly. How many labourers are absent? Which districts report rising deaths? Which wells appear contaminated? Which roads remain functional? Which neighbourhoods show signs of unrest? A city this large cannot operate purely on instinct forever. Eventually somebody needs a tablet filled with names and quantities. You also notice that fear changes public tolerance for interruption. During normal periods, citizens complain loudly about delays, inspections, restrictions, and interference from officials because Rome is full of people who believe every inconvenience personally insults them. Crisis softens some of that resistance, not completely. Romans remain Romans. Complaining survives nearly every historical period humanity invents. Still, fear changes the balance. Suddenly, inspection appears reasonable. A delayed shipment feels acceptable if it prevents contamination. A restricted street seems understandable if disease is rumoured nearby. A guard asking questions at a gate no longer feels merely intrusive. He feels useful. This psychological shift matters more than the individual rules themselves because authority expands most effectively when people begin requesting structure voluntarily. Rome understands this instinctively long before modern governments formalize it. The state does not always need overwhelming force if enough citizens already believe control is protective, and protection becomes the central language of crisis administration. The interesting part is how ordinary the machinery appears while this happens. There is no dramatic transformation and no giant lever being pulled somewhere beneath the Senate floor. Mostly, additional officials begin appearing in places where fewer officials stood previously. More records are requested, more movements are tracked, more instructions circulate, more visibility is expected from ordinary people. The city becomes administratively curious. Who lives there? Who travelled recently? Which merchants arrived from abroad? Which districts appear unstable? Which households stopped paying taxes? Which labour gangs failed to report for maintenance work? Crisis creates informational hunger because a government facing uncertainty starts collecting details in the hope that details create the illusion of control. Sometimes they even create actual control, which administrators naturally prefer. In crowded districts, landlords begin receiving additional scrutiny because they already function as informal supervisors over dense populations. Owners of apartment blocks know who disappears, who falls behind on rent, who suddenly leaves the city, who avoids public spaces, and who stops opening windows. The state rarely invents surveillance from nothing. It usually builds upon systems already embedded within daily life, and ancient Rome excels at this. Taxation systems become tracking systems. Military logistics become population logistics. Religious rituals become public reassurance mechanisms. Local reporting networks become informal observation structures. Existing machinery simply receives new pressure and new purpose. Meanwhile, ordinary people adapt remarkably quickly. Humans adjust to new expectations with uncomfortable speed. Within weeks, people alter routines they previously considered permanent. Market behavior changes, travel habits change, public gatherings thin out, families begin managing exposure quietly within households, even body language shifts. You can feel caution settling into the city through posture alone. Men pause slightly before accepting coins hand to hand. Porters hesitate near crowded alleys. Water carriers receive longer looks from customers. Nobody announces these changes formally because the system spreads through observation before it spreads through law. Roman administration understands another important truth as well. Visible activity calms populations. Whether every measure works perfectly matters less than whether the public sees coordinated action occurring. Officials walking streets, guards checking gates, priests organizing rituals, labor crews cleaning drains, and notices being posted all reassure the population that somebody remains in charge of the machinery. A city without visible coordination becomes psychologically dangerous very quickly because once people believe no one controls the system, they begin controlling themselves individually. Hoarding starts. Panic movement begins. Rumors outrun administration. Wealthier citizens flee. Trade slows. Grain prices climb. Crime rises and distrust multiplies. So the state projects motion constantly. Even uncertainty becomes wrapped in procedure. A clerk carrying records through the forum may not know any more than the citizens watching him pass, but the tablet matters. The appearance of administration matters. Someone is counting something somewhere, and strangely enough, that reassures people. Civilization depends heavily on organized paperwork and collective pretending, and Rome understands this better than most ancient states. In times of crisis, authority stops feeling distant. It becomes physical, visible and present in streets, gates, markets, temples, storage houses and water systems. The city begins leaning inward toward control because control feels steadier than fear, even when both are growing at the same time. The ship waits offshore longer than usual. Nobody announces a formal quarantine because Rome does not yet possess the later medieval vocabulary for that concept, but the harbour officials delay unloading anyway. Sailors remain aboard while local administrators inspect manifests, question crews, and quietly exchange rumours disguised as practical observations. The harbour smells like wet rope, olive oil, fish waste, and caution. Under normal circumstances, a merchant vessel arriving from abroad represents profit, tax revenue, grain supply, imported goods, and information from distant provinces. Rome survives through movement. The empire is essentially a giant transportation system wearing military boots. Now movement itself begins looking suspicious. That creates a problem immediately because Rome cannot simply stop circulation. Cities this large consume enormous quantities of food every day. Grain shipments continue whether officials feel nervous or not. Olive oil still travels. Livestock still moves across roads. Couriers still carry orders between provinces, and soldiers still transfer assignments. The system cannot freeze completely, so instead it slows selectively. This is where Roman containment logic starts appearing. Not scientific containment in the modern sense, but practical containment and observational containment developed by people who notice patterns before they understand causes. If illness seems connected to crowded ships, ports receive more scrutiny. If certain districts report higher deaths, people entering and leaving those districts attract attention. If travelers appear sick, exhausted, feverish or disoriented, guards begin asking more questions than usual. Rome does not isolate itself because it understands bacteria. Rome isolates because experience teaches that proximity sometimes produces consequences. You watch harbour workers handling cargo more carefully now. Men unloading amphorae hesitate before entering enclosed storage spaces below deck. Dock supervisors begin spacing labour gangs slightly farther apart where possible, though crowded ports leave little room for ideal arrangements. A few workers tie cloth around their faces. Mostly it accomplishes very little except making everyone feel marginally safer, which honestly describes a surprising amount of human history. Fear often invents rituals before it invents solutions. The roads leading into Rome also change in subtle ways. Checkpoint activity increases. Guards spend more time observing travelers before allowing entry. Wagons receive longer inspections. Messengers carrying official seals move quickly through gates while ordinary merchants wait outside the walls longer than they prefer. Nobody enjoys being delayed at a Roman gate. Travel already exhausts people under normal conditions. Roads are rough, inns vary from tolerable to deeply regrettable, and weather ruins schedules constantly. Now additional questioning appears at entry points because administrators want information attached to movement. Where did you come from? How long were you there? Which ports did your ship visit? Did anyone aboard become ill? And how many labourers travelled with you? The state begins connecting geography to risk. This matters because Rome governs through routes. Roads, ports, rivers, supply corridors, and military paths all hold the empire together. Crisis turns those same pathways into possible channels of danger, so administrators begin treating movement almost like water pressure inside a pipe system. Certain flows appear manageable, others feel threatened. You notice that inns near major roads become socially awkward places during periods of illness. Travellers always carry rumours with them, but now they also carry suspicion. An unfamiliar accent suddenly draws more attention than usual. Foreign merchants receive colder receptions in crowded taverns, and lodging owners begin quietly evaluating which guests might disturb other customers simply by appearing unhealthy. Nobody wants panic spreading inside a business already dependent on trust. Families traveling together receive different treatment than isolated individuals. A lone traveler coughing heavily while requesting a room near the city centre becomes a problem nobody wants responsibility for. Innkeepers may redirect him elsewhere simply to avoid attention from local officials or neighbouring merchants. Containment frequently operates through avoidance before it operates through law. The same thing happens inside residential districts. Certain buildings acquire reputations quickly. A household associated with repeated sickness becomes socially radioactive without anyone formally sealing the doors. Neighbours stop visiting. Delivery workers hesitate. Children disappear from nearby streets. The household effectively enters isolation through collective behavior. Rome contains through stigma as much as administration. This creates another layer of pressure because families often conceal illness to avoid exclusion. A household dependent on daily labor cannot afford total social avoidance. If neighbors stop purchasing goods or landlords fear contamination, survival becomes difficult very quickly. So people hide symptoms. This produces the ancient version of a familiar administrative problem. The state wants information, while citizens fear the consequences of providing it honestly. Every crisis eventually creates this tension. Officials respond by increasing observation. Local administrators rely heavily on neighborhood awareness because Rome lacks centralized medical systems capable of tracking populations efficiently. Information travels through landlords, shopkeepers, labor supervisors, bath attendants, grain distributors, and religious officials. Large cities always develop informal reporting networks because ordinary people notice disruptions long before bureaucracies do. The woman who stops collecting water from the public fountain gets noticed. The bakery missing 2 workers gets noticed. The apartment where shutters remain closed for days gets noticed. The mule driver who suddenly abandons his route gets noticed. Rome functions through dense human familiarity. People constantly observe one another simply by sharing confined urban space, and crisis transforms ordinary observation into civic intelligence. You also begin seeing social geography change. Wealthier citizens retreat toward less crowded residences if possible. Villas outside dense districts become more attractive. Open air starts feeling healthier whether or not it actually is. Narrow alleys and packed apartment blocks acquire psychological weight. Crowding itself begins feeling dangerous. Bathhouses provide another interesting example. Roman baths remain socially important because they serve hygienic, recreational, and political functions simultaneously. Business happens there, information circulates there, friendships operate there. Closing baths entirely risks public frustration. But anxiety changes usage patterns. Attendance drops unevenly. Some citizens avoid peak hours while others stop going altogether. Bath attendants become informal observers because they spend all day watching bodies. Skin discoloration, coughing, fever, weakness, and exhaustion all become visible there. The baths accidentally function as population monitoring sites during periods of illness because Rome rarely built systems for one purpose only. Military movement changes under containment logic as well. Soldiers traveling between provinces receive additional scrutiny because armies move large groups through multiple regions quickly. Commanders worry about weakened readiness if illness spreads through camps, so garrisons begin managing contact more carefully with nearby civilian populations. Again, not perfectly and not scientifically, simply practically. A sick army becomes useless, and Rome fears uselessness more than almost anything. The most revealing part of early quarantine logic is how calm it often appears from the outside. There are no giant barricades everywhere and no dramatic collapse. Mostly you observe delays, hesitations, rerouted movement, prolonged inspections, reduced trust, and growing administrative attention attached to mobility itself. Movement becomes conditional. That changes the emotional atmosphere of the empire quietly but deeply. Rome usually rewards motion. Trade expands through motion. Careers expand through motion. Armies conquer through motion. Messages travel through motion. Now movement acquires friction. A traveller approaching the city gate no longer feels like an ordinary visitor. He feels like a possible variable inside an already unstable equation. Guards study faces longer. Officials ask more questions. Crowds watch unfamiliar arrivals carefully. The empire remains connected, but connection itself starts feeling dangerous. By midday, the city smells warmer than it should. Heat settles into the stone streets and remains there while refuse softens in the gutters, and animal waste mixes with runoff from workshops and kitchens. Fish scales stick to market drains. Smoke drifts low between apartment blocks because the air barely moves in the narrower districts. Somewhere uphill, a clogged sewer forces wastewater back into a public lane, while three exhausted labourers stand nearby, studying the problem with the expression of men who already know it existed yesterday. Rome functions because somebody constantly cleans it. That is the part people often forget when imagining ancient cities. They picture marble temples, senators, triumphal arches, and dramatic speeches, while the actual city survives through hauling, scraping, draining, carrying, sweeping, repairing, and removing. Civilization is mostly maintenance, wearing a respectable cloak. A crisis places that maintenance under pressure immediately because the city already operates near practical limits during ordinary periods. Population density creates permanent logistical strain. Tens of thousands of people share water systems, roads, markets, storage facilities, bathhouses, bakeries, and public spaces every day. If labor disruptions begin spreading through the city, ordinary maintenance weakens quickly. When maintenance weakens, fear grows faster. You notice this first in smaller details. Street cleaning crews arrive later than usual because workers are missing. Market refuse remains piled longer in the heat. Public fountains attract larger crowds because nearby water access points stop functioning properly. Burial traffic increases along roads already crowded with grain carts and construction wagons. The city starts feeling overloaded. Roman officials understand something important about urban populations. Disorder spreads visually before it spreads materially. Citizens tolerate hardship more easily when systems still appear functional. The moment streets look neglected, confidence drops. So sanitation becomes political. Not because Roman administrators suddenly developed modern public health theory, but because filth makes people nervous during unstable periods. A dirty city looks uncontrolled, and an uncontrolled city invites panic. Labor supervisors therefore receive pressure from above to maintain visible order wherever possible. Drainage channels are inspected more aggressively. Waste removal crews work longer hours near public gathering areas. Market officials fine vendors for leaving spoiled goods exposed too long. Dead animals are removed faster from crowded districts because people associate visible decay with invisible danger. Even smell becomes administrative. A district that smells wrong attracts suspicion quickly. Odor creates rumor, rumor creates avoidance, and avoidance disrupts commerce. Rome dislikes disruptions to commerce almost as much as it dislikes disruptions to taxation. The grain system especially cannot tolerate instability. Every morning, huge quantities of grain move through the city toward bakeries, mills, warehouses, and distribution points. If labor shortages interrupt this flow, tension rises immediately because hungry populations become unpredictable populations. Roman administrators know this very well after centuries of watching crowds react to shortages. So grain movement receives protection before almost anything else. Officials prioritize road access for supply wagons. Soldiers escort shipments more visibly through unstable districts. Warehouse inventories receive closer monitoring while clerks record quantities constantly because missing grain creates administrative panic. The empire can survive frightened citizens longer than it can survive unfed citizens. You also begin noticing how crowded housing complicates everything. Many Romans live inside insulae, the tall apartment buildings packed tightly into dense urban districts. Entire families occupy cramped upper rooms connected through narrow stairways with poor ventilation and limited sanitation. Fires spread easily there. Illness spreads easily there. Rumors spread even faster. One sick tenant affects an entire structure psychologically. Neighbors begin avoiding shared staircases. Water collection routines become tense because dozens of households rely on the same public sources. Laundry spaces grow awkwardly quiet. Children disappear indoors. Residents study one another constantly without appearing to do so openly. Dense cities force strangers into familiarity. And that familiarity becomes uncomfortable during a crisis because everyone depends on everyone else behaving predictably. The baker needs healthy laborers. The laborers need functioning water access. Water carriers need passable streets. Streets require cleaning crews. Cleaning crews require food distribution. Urban life is basically organized dependency. Rome understands this structurally, even if ordinary citizens do not describe it that way. Administrators spend enormous energy keeping systems interconnected smoothly enough that people stop noticing them entirely. Crisis removes that invisibility. Now, every interruption becomes visible. A broken fountain attracts crowds immediately because alternative water sources are already strained. A delayed grain convoy causes nervous discussion in nearby markets. Missing sanitation crews produce visible filth that citizens interpret as administrative weakness. The city begins communicating stress through infrastructure. Bathhouses become particularly complicated environments during this period. Under normal circumstances, baths operate almost continuously. Citizens wash, exercise, conduct business, socialize, negotiate favors, and exchange information there. Water systems feeding the baths represent major engineering achievements, but they also require constant labor and fuel. A crisis threatens both. If laborers disappear, maintenance weakens. If fuel shipments slow, heating systems struggle. If fear spreads among the population, attendance changes unpredictably. Some bathhouses remain crowded because routine comforts people. Others empty rapidly because enclosed spaces begin feeling dangerous. Managers adapt unevenly. Some increase cleaning visibly to reassure patrons. Others quietly reduce operations to conserve labor and resources. Again, Rome responds practically rather than scientifically. Visibility matters constantly. Workers scrubbing floors where citizens can see them become part of public reassurance. Drain maintenance near major roads gets prioritized because neglect in visible spaces damages confidence faster. This creates an interesting imbalance. Wealthier districts often receive faster maintenance because they contain influential citizens and politically important buildings. Poorer neighborhoods may experience slower sanitation response despite often facing worse conditions. Crisis management rarely distributes attention evenly. Administrators protect stability where instability would produce the greatest political consequences. Ancient Rome is no exception. You can feel the difference walking through various districts. Near administrative centers, crews work actively clearing debris and monitoring water access. Farther into crowded residential areas, problems linger longer. Citizens compensate privately where they can. Families boil water. Courtyards get cleaned more carefully. Neighbors organize informal waste removal when official crews fail to appear promptly. The state expands during a crisis, but ordinary people still carry much of the practical burden themselves. Street movement also changes subtly. Crowded commercial routes become more psychologically tense. People still travel because they must. Work continues, deliveries continue, markets continue, but public movement acquires caution layered beneath routine. Citizens avoid unnecessary contact while still operating inside crowded environments where avoiding contact entirely is impossible. Rome cannot socially distance itself. It barely possesses enough room for ordinary movement already. So the city develops partial adaptations instead. Merchants conduct more business outdoors where possible. Some transactions become quicker and less conversational. Public gatherings lose a degree of looseness. Citizens spend less idle time lingering in crowded areas without purpose. Not entirely. Humans remain social creatures even during danger, but enough changes to alter the atmosphere. The city feels watchful. Officials contribute to this intentionally. More inspections occur publicly because visible oversight reassures nervous populations. Supervisors appear near markets more often. Water officials travel between fountains and cisterns checking functionality. Sanitation crews receive direct observation from administrators carrying tablets filled with inventories and schedules. Paperwork expands during instability because administrators crave measurable order. How many carts removed refused today? Which fountains require repair? How many labourers fail to appear? Which districts report rising complaints? And which roads remain obstructed? The city becomes a giant accounting exercise. And through all of this, Rome tries to maintain normality visibly. Temples remain open. Markets continue operating. Public notices appear regularly. Officials walk streets with purpose. The machinery keeps moving because stopping the machinery entirely would terrify people more than the crisis itself. That is the difficult balance urban governments attempt during instability. Too little action creates panic. Too much disruption also creates panic. So Rome manages appearances carefully while managing infrastructure constantly. The city becomes less a place of civic pride and more a system requiring continuous stabilization, like a giant organism cleaning itself while still trying to look dignified, which honestly describes most governments during crisis once you strip away the marble decoration. The procession moves slowly enough for everyone to watch it properly, and that is partly the point. Priests walk through the street carrying ritual objects polished brighter than usual while incense smoke drifts upward into the evening air. Citizens step aside to create space without being directly ordered to do so. Temple attendants scatter offerings across stone roads recently cleaned for the occasion. Somewhere ahead, an animal waits near the altar while nearby officials maintain expressions suggesting solemn confidence rather than uncertainty. Rome prefers authority to appear composed, especially when nobody fully understands what is happening. During periods of illness and instability, religious ritual becomes more visible because ritual provides structure, not magical structure necessarily, but administrative structure, emotional structure, and public structure. Human beings tolerate fear more effectively when fear receives ceremony. Roman religion operates differently from many later belief systems. It focuses heavily on correct performance, obligation, timing, and civic participation. Ritual is not merely personal spirituality, it is public maintenance. The gods protect Rome partly because Rome continues acknowledging them properly, or at least that is the official understanding. So when a crisis spreads through the city, religious activity increases because officials cannot afford spiritual silence. Silence suggests abandonment. Ritual suggests management. You begin seeing more public sacrifices organized near important civic spaces. Priests consult omens more frequently. Magistrates sponsor ceremonies intended to reassure citizens that divine order remains intact. Temples receive heavier attendance, not because every citizen suddenly becomes deeply philosophical, but because collective ritual reduces uncertainty. Shared behavior calms populations, and Rome understands this instinctively. The state and religion already function closely together under ordinary circumstances. Political leaders oversee religious obligations. Priests hold public authority. Sacred calendars regulate civic life. Festivals reinforce social hierarchy and collective identity. Crisis simply intensifies those existing relationships. Now rituals carry additional weight because people start looking for explanations everywhere. Disease without clear cause creates interpretive chaos. Citizens debate whether the gods are angry, whether foreigners introduced contamination, whether neglected rituals weakened divine protection, or whether moral decline damaged Rome spiritually. Human beings rarely leave empty spaces where explanations should be. They fill it quickly, often with confidence exceeding evidence. Roman officials know uncontrolled interpretation can become dangerous. If panic spreads through rumor alone, administrative authority weakens. Religious ceremony therefore performs another useful function. It centralizes meaning. The state effectively says, here is the explanation framework, here is the response, here is the corrective action, and here is the public behavior expected from responsible citizens. Participate in the ritual. Attend the procession, observe the sacrifice, maintain order. The ceremony itself matters partly because everyone witnesses everyone else participating. Ritual becomes visible compliance. A citizen refusing involvement during stable periods may simply appear eccentric. During a crisis, refusal attracts suspicion much faster. If the city collectively seeks divine favor, absence suddenly looks meaningful. Neighbors notice who attends public rites and who remains indoors unnecessarily. Rome constantly measures belonging through participation. Religious life provides convenient opportunities for that measurement because ceremonies gather populations visibly. Officials can observe crowd behavior, public mood, social tension, and general compliance all at once. The rituals also create rhythm during unstable periods. That rhythm matters more than modern people sometimes realize. Crisis disrupts ordinary routines aggressively. Markets fluctuate, travel patterns shift, work schedules change, families alter domestic habits, religious ceremonies restore predictable structure temporarily. On certain days, citizens know where to gather, what to watch, what offerings to bring, what routes processions follow, and what behavior is expected. Predictability comforts populations. Even repetitive ritual comforts populations, especially repetitive rituals. Human beings often mistake familiar procedure for actual safety, and governments throughout history notice this quickly. The temples themselves become important emotional centers during periods of instability. Citizens visit seeking reassurance, interpretation, or simply organized quiet. Priests receive questions they cannot fully answer, which places them in the same position as nearly every administrator during every historical crisis. Still, uncertainty delivered calmly feels more tolerable than uncertainty delivered chaotically. So priests maintain composure carefully. Their movements remain deliberate, their clothing remains immaculate. Their ceremonies continue according to established sequence because sequence implies control. A ritual performed properly suggests the world itself may still function properly. Meanwhile, the state benefits from the public visibility of all this activity. A silent government appears weak. An active religious system suggests civilization still operates normally. Citizens watching processions, hearing temple announcements, and observing sacrifices receive constant reminders that institutions remain intact. The machinery still moves. That reassurance matters tremendously in dense urban environments where rumor travels rapidly. Rome cannot prevent anxiety entirely, but it can compete with anxiety using public spectacle organized around order instead of panic. Religious festivals sometimes continue even during difficult periods for precisely this reason. Cancelling major rituals outright risks communicating collapse psychologically. Continuing them, even in altered form, reinforces continuity. Continuity becomes a political resource in times of crisis. You also notice how ritual physically reorganizes public space. Streets get cleared, crowds gather according to expected patterns, guards appear along routes. Temple workers coordinate movement and offerings. Administrative oversight blends seamlessly with sacred ceremony. Rome rarely separates governance from symbolism completely. The same officials overseeing taxation, law, military logistics, and sanitation may also sponsor public rights. Citizens therefore experience authority as a unified structure rather than separate institutions competing independently. The gods, the state, and public order all occupy the same civic landscape. This arrangement becomes especially useful during periods of instability because religious participation transforms obedience into communal responsibility rather than simple submission. Citizens are not merely following officials, they are protecting Rome collectively through proper behavior. That distinction matters psychologically because people resist coercion more aggressively than shared obligation. The rituals also reinforce hierarchy subtly but constantly. Wealthier citizens fund ceremonies publicly. Priests maintain elevated status. Magistrates appear prominently during sacred events. The city watches elite figures participating visibly in stabilizing rituals. Authority demonstrates itself through presence. At the same time, ordinary people perform their own smaller acts of ritual management privately. Household shrines receive more attention. Families leave offerings more regularly. Domestic religious routines become stricter because private control feels valuable when public conditions seem uncertain. Again, ritual creates structure. Light the lamp properly, leave the offering properly, observe the date properly, maintain the household correctly. Small, repeated actions make unstable periods feel manageable, and honestly, governments adore populations occupied with organized routine. The most revealing aspect of Roman ritual appeasement is how practical it often appears beneath the sacred language. Processions organize crowds peacefully. Ceremonies reinforce public expectations. Priests distribute approved interpretations. Citizens demonstrate visible participation. Authorities project continuity. Religion stabilizes behavior, not perfectly. Nothing stabilizes behavior perfectly. Fear still spreads, rumors still circulate, distrust still grows in certain districts. But ritual slows fragmentation. It gives frightened populations a framework sturdy enough to stand inside temporarily. Rome, more than most ancient societies, understands the value of collective performance because once people stop believing the system functions, the system becomes much harder to operate. So the incense burns, the processions continue, the sacrifices remain carefully scheduled. Somewhere beneath the smoke and ceremony, the state quietly measures whether the city still obeys the rhythm being set for it. The notice appears before sunrise while a clerk presses fresh wax seals into place, and two assistants secure the wooden tablet against a public wall already crowded with older announcements. Nearby shopkeepers pretend not to stare while reading it immediately anyway. A grain porter pauses long enough to study the first few lines before continuing downhill toward the market district. Within an hour, the information has already travelled farther through conversation than the physical notice ever will. Rome runs on posted instructions. Under ordinary conditions, Roman governance can move slowly and theatrically. Discussions happen, rival officials compete, political maneuvering drags decisions sideways because ambitious men enjoy delaying one another almost as much as they enjoy appearing important in public. Crisis shortens patience dramatically. Now the city wants action, visible enough to reassure frightened populations and practical enough to prevent further disorder. This is where emergency authority expands, not always through dramatic constitutional transformation, but through accumulated exceptions, temporary restrictions, temporary inspections, temporary movement controls, temporary powers granted to specific officials because conditions supposedly require efficiency. Governments throughout history adore the word temporary because it sounds polite and responsible while leaving the door comfortably unlocked. You watch magistrates begin issuing directives with less ceremony than usual. Local administrators receive broader discretion to enforce regulations quickly. Harbour officials gain authority to delay incoming ships without waiting through lengthy procedural review. Market supervisors intervene more aggressively in disputes involving shortages or suspected contamination. The system becomes less negotiable. That change affects ordinary citizens immediately because Rome normally contains enormous amounts of informal flexibility. Merchants bribe inspectors. Guards overlook minor violations. Local relationships soften rigid enforcement. Cities survive partly because small rules bend constantly. Emergency periods tighten that flexibility. Now officials become less willing to ignore violations because responsibility itself feels heavier. A careless decision during stable times may create inconvenience. A careless decision during a crisis might produce visible consequences traveling upward through the administrative chain. Nobody wants blame attached to their name during unstable periods, so enforcement hardens. Guards question travelers longer at gates. Market inspections increase because food shortages create political danger quickly. Warehouse inventories receive repeated review because disappearing supplies now suggest either corruption or instability, both of which administrators hate equally. Everything starts producing paperwork. Rome already loves records under normal circumstances. During a crisis, record-keeping multiplies because officials need proof they acted correctly. Written orders protect administrators from future accusations. A magistrate can point toward documented instructions and say these measures were necessary under the conditions at the time. Civilization produces mountains of paperwork largely because human beings fear responsibility. The interesting part is how emergency authority often expands through practical necessity rather than ideological ambition. The city genuinely requires faster coordination. Grain distribution cannot wait for endless procedural disputes if shortages appear. Sanitation crews need immediate redirection when districts become unstable. Soldiers must move quickly if unrest threatens supply routes. The machinery requires speed, and speed nearly always concentrates authority. Citizens gradually adjust to this altered rhythm. People stop expecting negotiation in certain situations. Delays become more acceptable. Inspections become more common. Public spaces feel more supervised without necessarily becoming openly oppressive. Rome, in times of crisis, does not always resemble a brutal occupation force controlling terrified populations. More often, it resembles a giant institution becoming increasingly procedural. The city starts treating uncertainty like an administrative problem requiring expanded oversight. Officials appear in more places. Questions become more detailed. Permissions matter more. A blocked road that would normally provoke outrage now produces weary acceptance because fear changes expectations. People tolerate inconvenience when inconvenience arrives wrapped in the language of protection. The same thing happens with public gatherings. Rome depends heavily on crowd activity through markets, baths, temples, festivals, legal proceedings, and entertainment venues. Restricting assemblies therefore affects both economics and psychology. Administrators proceed carefully. Large events may continue under tighter supervision. Guards monitor crowd behavior more visibly. Officials become quicker to disperse disturbances before they spread. Certain gatherings receive postponements framed as practical caution rather than political control. Emergency governance always describes itself as temporary management rather than permanent transformation. Citizens are told these measures exist only until stability returns. Sometimes that remains true. Sometimes the administrative habits survive much longer than the original crisis. History contains many examples of governments discovering they quite enjoy powers originally justified as emergency necessities. Rome is no exception. You also begin seeing how local elites cooperate with expanded authority because instability threatens their own position directly. Wealthy property owners want order restored. Merchants want trade routes functioning. Landlords want rents collected. Religious officials want crowds remaining calm enough for public ritual to continue. Crisis creates strange coalitions around stability. Even citizens privately uncomfortable with increased oversight may still support temporary restrictions if alternatives appear worse. Human beings generally prefer controlled inconvenience over uncontrolled uncertainty. That preference quietly strengthens administrative systems. The state learns useful lessons during emergencies. It learns which districts require heavier supervision, which officials respond efficiently, which supply routes fail under pressure, which regulations citizens tolerate with minimal resistance, and which institutions calm populations successfully. Crises become large-scale administrative experiments, whether governments admit this openly or not. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue adapting behavior around the expanding procedural landscape. Merchants carry documentation more carefully. Travelers prepare for questioning before reaching the gates. Citizens avoid activities likely to attract official attention unnecessarily. The city becomes psychologically narrower, not entirely fearful, just more cautious. People begin calculating interactions differently. A casual dispute in the market suddenly feels riskier if guards already patrol nearby more aggressively. Public drunkenness draws faster intervention. Crowding around official buildings decreases because citizens sense reduced tolerance for disorder. You can feel the boundaries tightening. The physical city remains largely unchanged. The emotional rules governing movement through it do not. Another important shift occurs inside administration itself. Officials begin communicating upward more frequently because emergency periods punish informational silence. A local supervisor who fails to report worsening conditions risks blame later if problems expand visibly. So reports multiply. Numbers travel constantly between offices. Grain counts, labor shortages, death totals, road conditions, harbor delays, arrest records. The city slowly transforms into a network of monitored conditions. And beneath all of this sits a simple political reality Rome understands extremely well. Fear reduces resistance. Romans still complain, resist, evade, and manipulate systems whenever possible, but frightened populations become more willing to trade freedom of movement for predictability. Expanded oversight feels tolerable if officials promise stability in return. Governments remember this lesson very clearly once learned. That is why temporary powers tend to linger around the edges of institutions afterward. Administrators become accustomed to broader authority. Citizens become accustomed to heavier supervision. Procedures created during emergency periods settle quietly into normal governance. A restricted gate eventually just becomes a guarded gate. An inspection routine simply becomes routine. And somewhere inside the administrative machinery, temporary starts sounding remarkably permanent. The soldiers arrive without fanfare. There is no triumphal music and no cheering crowds, only a column of men moving through the city at dawn, while labourers clearing market debris step aside automatically to let them pass. Their armour looks practical rather than ceremonial. Shields carry scratches from actual use. Several mules follow behind carrying supply bundles instead of trophies. This is not conquest. This is internal stabilization. Rome usually prefers keeping military force pointed outward. Armies belong on frontiers, along roads, near rebellious provinces, or guarding trade corridors far from the urban center. A strong empire projects power away from itself because soldiers inside civilian life too visibly can make a government look nervous. During a crisis, nervous governments become practical governments. So troops begin appearing in places where citizens are accustomed to seeing clerks, labourers, merchants and magistrates instead. The change feels subtle at first. A few guards near grain warehouses, additional patrols near major gates, soldiers accompanying supply convoys, moving through crowded districts. Then, gradually, the military presence becomes woven into ordinary movement across the city. You realize quickly that Rome does not redeploy soldiers into civilian spaces primarily because it expects rebellion everywhere. Most of the time, administrators fear disruption more than open revolt. Grain theft, supply interruption, panic movement, rioting around shortages, disorder near distribution centers. The military provides structure. Soldiers already operate through schedules, hierarchy, discipline, inventory systems, logistical coordination, and rapid obedience. Crisis governance admires those qualities enormously because civilian administration often moves slower and argues more. Armies solve arguments by reducing the number of people allowed to have them. That efficiency becomes attractive during unstable periods. You watch soldiers escorting grain shipments through districts where tensions around food access remain high. Their presence discourages theft, partly through force and partly through visibility. Citizens standing in ration lines behave differently when armored men remain nearby observing crowd movement carefully. Order becomes physical. The interesting part is how quickly populations normalize military supervision once it becomes associated with stability. At first, civilians study the soldiers constantly. Children follow patrols through the streets. Merchants pause conversations when armed groups pass nearby. Citizens evaluate whether the deployment signals worsening conditions. Eventually, routine settles around the presence. A soldier guarding a warehouse entrance simply becomes part of the environment after enough days pass. Human beings adapt remarkably fast to visible authority if it remains predictable. Rome understands predictability matters almost as much as force itself. An unpredictable military presence frightens populations. A structured military presence reassures them while simultaneously discouraging resistance. You also begin noticing that soldiers handle tasks extending far beyond obvious security work. Military logistics systems become extremely valuable during crises because armies already specialize in moving supplies efficiently across difficult terrain under unstable conditions. That experience transfers naturally into civilian emergencies. Troops help coordinate transport routes, clear obstructed roads, supervise labor gangs unloading critical shipments, and maintain guarded movement between warehouses and distribution centers. A functioning empire tends to use whatever machinery already works best under pressure. In Rome, that machinery is often military. This creates an important psychological shift inside the city. Citizens start associating ordinary civilian stability with armed oversight. Food arrives safely because soldiers escort it. Gates remain organized because soldiers supervise entry. Public disturbances end quickly because soldiers intervene before crowds grow too large. The military stops feeling distant. It becomes embedded inside the daily urban rhythm. For some citizens, this feels reassuring. Wealthier residents especially tend to appreciate visible order because instability threatens property, trade, and political influence directly. Merchants also prefer predictable streets over chaotic ones, even if additional oversight accompanies that predictability. Other citizens experience the change differently. Laborers waiting near checkpoints resent delays. Travelers dislike additional questioning from armed guards. Crowded districts grow tense when patrols linger too long near apartment blocks. Rome understands this risk, which is why administrators usually prefer soldiers to appear disciplined and restrained rather than openly aggressive. Force works best when it rarely needs demonstration. A silent line of armed men standing beside a grain convoy communicates enough already. The city itself begins reorganizing around military movement patterns. Certain streets receive priority clearing because supply convoys require passage. Storage facilities gain guarded perimeters. Temporary barracks appear closer to administrative centers or major logistical routes. Civilian geography becomes partially militarized without formally declaring itself so. That distinction matters because Rome wants stability, not visible occupation. Officials understand populations tolerate military integration more easily when daily life continues appearing relatively normal. Markets still open, temples still function, public notices still appear, bathhouses still operate. The city keeps moving. It simply moves under heavier observation now. You notice another change inside the soldiers themselves. Troops redeployed into civilian environments become part security force, part logistical workforce, and part symbolic authority. Their duties blur together. One day they escort grain wagons. The next day they supervise road clearing. Then they guard administrative buildings during public announcements. Then they help maintain controlled access near overcrowded districts. The military effectively becomes mobile infrastructure. Rome values this flexibility enormously because armies already possess chain-of-command systems capable of rapid coordination. Civilian institutions often lack that responsiveness during unstable periods. A magistrate can issue instructions. A military officer can implement them quickly across large groups of disciplined personnel. Governments facing crises appreciate implementation more than elegance. You also begin seeing how soldiers gather information simply by existing visibly inside civilian life. Patrols observe crowd behavior, overhear rumors, identify unstable districts, notice supply problems, and report disruptions upward through military channels already designed for rapid communication. The army accidentally becomes an observation network. Again, Rome rarely builds systems for one purpose only. Military deployment also affects psychology in quieter ways. Citizens standing near armed patrols tend to regulate behavior automatically. Disputes shorten. Public drunkenness decreases near checkpoints. Crowds organize themselves more carefully around guarded areas. Visible authority encourages self-management. That principle appears repeatedly throughout Roman governance because the state prefers citizens policing themselves whenever possible. Constant direct enforcement becomes expensive quickly. Soldiers therefore function partly as reminders. The system is watching. Remain orderly, continue moving, do not complicate operations unnecessarily. Most people comply because ordinary life already requires exhausting amounts of effort during crisis periods. Citizens focused on obtaining food, maintaining work, protecting families, and avoiding illness rarely seek direct confrontation with organized military structures. Stability becomes its own incentive. Meanwhile, administrators observe carefully which measures succeed, which deployments calm tensions, which districts require permanent supervision, which routes remain vulnerable, which officials coordinate effectively with military command. Emergency redeployment becomes a learning process for the state itself, and states tend to keep lessons that prove useful. That is how temporary military visibility inside civilian life slowly becomes normalized. What first appears exceptional eventually starts feeling administrative. The soldiers remain near the warehouses. The guards continue inspecting travelers. The patrols keep walking familiar routes. The city adjusts around them. And before long, civilians struggle remembering exactly when armed supervision stopped feeling unusual in the first place. The window opens slightly, then closes again. Nothing dramatic happens afterward. No confrontation, no accusation shouted into the street. Just a quiet adjustment in behavior. A woman carrying water pauses near a neighboring doorway longer than necessary. A shopkeeper notices that a customer who normally visits every morning has not appeared for several days. Two laborers unloading amphorae lower their voices when discussing a household farther uphill where shutters remain closed through midday. The city begins watching itself. Rome already operates through constant observation during ordinary periods because dense urban life makes privacy difficult. People live close together, work close together, eat close together, and depend on shared infrastructure constantly. Citizens naturally notice routines because routines are unavoidable in crowded environments. Who opens their stall before dawn? Who returns late from the docks? Who receives regular deliveries? Who disappears for several days? Most of this information remains socially harmless during stable periods. During crisis, that same awareness becomes administrative material. Observation acquires weight. You notice how quickly ordinary curiosity transforms into practical vigilance once uncertainty spreads deeply enough. Citizens begin interpreting disruptions differently. A missing neighbor no longer simply seems absent. Absence becomes a possible indicator of illness, concealed deaths, flight, or unrest. Large cities depend heavily on predictable repetition. When repetition breaks, people start searching for reasons immediately. Roman officials understand they cannot monitor millions of daily interactions directly. No ancient state possesses enough personnel for that level of centralized oversight. Instead, Rome relies on layered awareness already embedded within society itself. Landlords observe tenants, shopkeepers observe customers, foremen observe labor crews, temple attendants observe regular visitors, port officials observe travelers. The state simply learns how to use information already moving naturally through crowded human systems. This creates a strange atmosphere throughout the city. Nobody officially declares a surveillance regime. Citizens are not marching through streets denouncing one another publicly every hour. The reality feels quieter. People simply become more careful because they understand attention has consequences now. A baker whose workers suddenly stop reporting may face questions from local officials regarding illness, labor shortages, or hidden disruptions. A landlord concealing deaths inside a crowded apartment block risks punishment if neighboring residents report suspicious activity first. Merchants receiving foreign shipments become objects of greater scrutiny because movement itself now carries implied risk. The system rewards visibility and punishes concealment. That principle intensifies rapidly during a crisis. You begin seeing clerks collecting more detailed records from local administrators. Population counts receive updates more frequently. Work crews submit attendance lists more carefully. Warehouse inventories get cross-checked repeatedly because missing supplies during unstable periods trigger immediate suspicion. Numbers become moral indicators. If quantities do not align properly, officials assume someone is hiding something somewhere. This creates pressure throughout every layer of urban life. Even small inconsistencies attract attention. A district reporting fewer labourers than expected receives inspection. A grain depot losing inventory unexpectedly prompts investigation. A household avoiding tax collection visits suddenly appears suspicious rather than merely disorganized. Administrative curiosity expands aggressively during instability. The city responds psychologically. Citizens begin managing appearances more consciously because appearing stable matters almost as much as actually being stable. Families continue opening shutters each morning, even during illness, to avoid attracting concern. Shopkeepers maintain regular schedules despite reduced business because inconsistency invites questions. Normality becomes performance. And most governments prefer populations performing normality during crises because visible routine stabilizes public mood. You also notice how reporting systems remain heavily informal despite increasing administrative involvement. Rome lacks centralized medical reporting structures or standardized investigative agencies, so information moves through human relationships. That movement creates distortion naturally. Rumors expand while traveling. Fear alters interpretation. Personal grudges become disguised as civic concern. A citizen reporting suspicious behavior may genuinely fear illness spreading nearby. He may also dislike the neighbor personally. Crisis often blurs the line between public vigilance and private resentment. Authorities understand this imperfectly but still rely on the information because they possess few alternatives. Better flawed information than complete blindness. This attitude appears repeatedly in Roman administration. Officials often prefer excessive reporting over insufficient reporting because uncertainty feels dangerous to governing systems. So more eyes become useful. You begin noticing increased inspection activity around transportation routes especially. Gate officials question travelers longer. Harbour supervisors review manifests repeatedly. Supply convoys receive additional verification before entering major storage areas. Movement produces paperwork now. A merchant transporting grain through multiple districts may encounter inspections at each stage, not because every official suspects criminal behavior personally, but because responsibility has become fragmented upward through the chain of command. Nobody wants to be the official who overlooked something important. That fear expands inspection culture enormously. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens adapt through caution and self-regulation. Public coughing attracts immediate attention. Citizens avoid discussing illness loudly in crowded places because rumors spread quickly. Families quietly monitor one another for visible symptoms while pretending not to do so openly. Social trust narrows, not completely. Humans still cooperate constantly because cities cannot function otherwise. Neighbors still share supplies. Laborers still work collectively. Merchants still depend on repeated customers. But beneath ordinary interaction sits increased evaluation. Who appears to be secretive? Who traveled recently? Who stopped attending rituals? And who avoids crowded spaces unusually often? Rome becomes socially investigative. The apartment buildings intensify this effect dramatically. In crowded insulae, dozens of families share stairways, courtyards, water access, and common movement routes. Complete privacy barely exists there under ideal conditions. During a crisis, dense housing turns observation into necessity. Residents monitor shared spaces carefully because one household's problems affect everyone nearby. Strange smells, prolonged silence, irregular activity, or concealed refuse immediately attract notice because consequences spread physically through confined environments. Again, this is not organized espionage in the dramatic sense. It is practical urban awareness sharpened by fear. Rome does not suddenly transform into a city of professional informants. It becomes a city where ordinary people understand that information now carries survival value, and survival value changes behavior quickly. Officials encourage this indirectly through visible responsiveness. When citizens report disturbances or suspected illness and administrators respond visibly, public reporting increases. People learn that observation connects to action. The system appears attentive. Citizens tolerate heavy observation more easily when they believe authorities remain actively engaged in maintaining order. Neglect breeds resentment. Responsive oversight feels more legitimate even when intrusive. You also notice how religious participation intersects with suspicion culture. Citizens absent from public rituals during crisis periods attract attention because ritual attendance signals communal loyalty and normal behavior. Withdrawal from public religious life may indicate illness, fear, dissent, or social instability. Again, participation becomes visible reassurance. The state quietly measures cohesion through presence. And through all of this, Rome keeps generating records constantly. Tablets filled with names, district reports, supply inventories, inspection notes, labor tallies, travel authorizations. The city increasingly describes itself through documentation because documentation creates administrative confidence, or at least administrative confidence theatre, which governments often accept as close enough. The most interesting part is how little direct force inspection systems sometimes require once populations internalize observation psychologically. Citizens begin adjusting behavior voluntarily because uncertainty around scrutiny encourages caution automatically. People avoid attracting attention. They maintain routines, they display compliance publicly, they conceal disruptions carefully. The system becomes partially self-enforcing, and that is usually the stage governments prefer most. Before dawn, the cleaning crews are already working. The streets remain dim, except for scattered torchlight reflecting off wet stone, while a cart piled with refuse creaks downhill toward disposal grounds outside the busiest districts. Two labourers scrape compacted waste away from drainage channels, while another pours water across the street from a public cistern. Nearby, an exhausted supervisor checks names against a wax tablet, as if confirming the existence of sanitation workers somehow guarantees the city itself still functions properly. In a way, it does. Rome survives through maintenance more than grandeur. The aqueducts matter because somebody repairs them constantly. Sewers matter because crews clear blockages continuously. Roads matter because labourers haul debris away before movement slows completely. Large cities are less triumphs of architecture than triumphs of organised cleaning. Crisis places enormous pressure on that organisation. Once illness spreads visibly enough through the population, sanitation stops looking like ordinary labour and starts looking like state defence, not military defence, psychological defence, administrative defence. A clean street communicates control. A neglected street communicates failure. Roman officials understand this immediately because urban populations interpret visible disorder emotionally long before they analyze it rationally. Overflowing refuse, clogged drains, stagnant water, and dead animals left unattended create fear even among citizens who possess no scientific understanding of disease transmission. People instinctively distrust filth during unstable periods, and honestly, they are usually correct to do so. You begin noticing that sanitation crews receive greater supervision than usual. Inspectors appear more frequently near drainage systems, fountains, bathhouses, market districts, and refuse routes. Labour attendance gets monitored carefully because shortages among cleaning crews now threaten public confidence directly. A missing soldier weakens a patrol. A missing sanitation worker weakens the city itself. That is how administrators begin viewing the problem. The markets receive particular attention because markets combine nearly every condition officials currently distrust: crowding, food exposure, animal waste, foreign travelers, noise, heat, constant human contact. Yet markets cannot close entirely. Rome depends on continuous food movement too heavily for that, so administrators attempt regulation instead. Vendors receive stricter instructions regarding waste disposal. Spoiled goods are removed faster. Butchers face heavier inspection. Drainage near fish stalls gets cleaned repeatedly because smell alone can destabilize confidence in crowded areas. Again, perception matters enormously. Citizens who believe the markets are unsafe may stop purchasing food reliably. Panic buying begins, hoarding follows, supply pressure increases artificially. Administrators therefore treat visible sanitation as economic stabilization as much as public cleanliness. The state cleans partly to calm people. You also notice changes around public water access. Rome's fountains normally function as busy social centers where citizens gather constantly throughout the day. Water carriers fill containers there, laborers rinse tools there, families collect household supplies there. During crisis periods, these crowded points suddenly appear vulnerable. Officials respond through increased maintenance and observation. Fountain systems receive more frequent inspection. Broken spouts get repaired faster. Overflow drainage becomes a priority because standing water now attracts suspicion automatically. Guards occasionally appear nearby simply to regulate crowd movement and prevent disputes during busy collection periods. Water access becomes politically sensitive very quickly in large cities. A damaged fountain during stable times creates inconvenience. This creates fear. So repair crews move aggressively wherever possible because functioning water systems reassure populations that the city remains operational. Bathhouses face similar pressure but with additional complications. Roman baths consume enormous resources through fuel, labor, water maintenance, cleaning crews, and attendants. During instability, maintaining those operations becomes increasingly difficult. Yet closing baths entirely risks public frustration and loss of routine. Administrators therefore encourage visible cleaning efforts inside major bath complexes. Floors get scrubbed more publicly. Water circulation receives closer monitoring. Staff become informal enforcement figures reminding visitors about expected behavior. The baths begin functioning almost like supervised environments rather than purely recreational ones. Citizens notice this immediately. People speak more quietly. Crowding patterns shift. Attendants observe patrons more carefully. The atmosphere changes from relaxed social movement toward controlled public routine. Not oppressive exactly, just regulated. That word describes much of Roman crisis management better than harsher modern terminology often does. The burial system also changes significantly during periods of heightened illness. Rome already maintains strong customs surrounding death, funeral movement, and burial practices. Crisis pressures those systems hard because increased deaths create logistical strain quickly. Bodies require transport, transport requires labor, labor requires organization. And all of it must happen without visibly overwhelming the city. Officials therefore begin enforcing stricter handling procedures around burial movement. Routes get managed more carefully. Certain districts receive quicker collection responses. Funeral gatherings may become smaller or more controlled depending on local conditions. Again, not because Rome fully understands disease scientifically, mostly because unmanaged death destabilizes populations psychologically. Visible corpses destroy confidence in governance very quickly, so the state intervenes heavily around removal, transport, and burial organization. You can feel this discipline spreading physically through the streets themselves. Traffic patterns become more regulated around sanitation operations. Refuse carts receive movement priority through crowded routes. Labour gangs clear passageways earlier in the day before markets fully crowd the roads. The city reorganises itself around maintenance urgency. Citizens gradually adapt behaviour in response. People dispose of waste more cautiously because penalties increase for creating public sanitation problems. Shopkeepers clean storefront areas more frequently to avoid attracting inspectors. Households monitor smells, refuse build-up and drainage near entrances more carefully because neighbours now interpret neglect suspiciously. Cleanliness becomes civic performance. That performance matters because Rome increasingly associates visible order with collective responsibility. Citizens are expected to contribute to stability through disciplined public behavior, dispose properly, maintain property properly, avoid obstructing drains, report problems quickly. The state transforms sanitation into a moral obligation as much as a practical one. Most citizens accept this logic because unstable cities frighten them too. You also begin seeing how sanitation enforcement overlaps with class divisions inside the city. Wealthier districts often receive faster maintenance response and more consistent cleaning because political influence shapes administrative priorities naturally. Poorer neighborhoods experience heavier scrutiny but sometimes weaker service. Inspectors may patrol aggressively while repair crews arrive slowly. This imbalance creates resentment quietly beneath the surface, though most citizens remain too focused on daily survival to challenge the structure openly. Rome becomes intensely managerial. Everything gets categorized according to stability value. Which streets matter most, which districts require calming, which markets require heavier oversight, which labor systems cannot fail. The city turns into a giant hierarchy of maintenance priorities. Meanwhile, sanitation workers themselves become strangely important figures inside the urban system. Their labor remains dirty, exhausting, poorly celebrated, and absolutely essential. Without continuous cleaning, hauling, draining, and removal, the city begins deteriorating visibly within days. Crisis simply makes that dependence impossible to ignore. And so before sunrise each morning the crews return, scraping drains, clearing refuse, flushing streets, repairing channels, moving through the sleeping city like part labor force and part psychological maintenance operation, because Rome understands something every large government eventually learns. People can endure hardship surprisingly well. What they struggle enduring is the visible feeling that nobody remains in control of the mess. The line begins forming before the grain arrives. People gather quietly near the distribution point while the street is still cool enough to breathe comfortably. Some carry baskets, others hold worn sacks folded beneath their arms. A few citizens lean against nearby walls with the tired patience of people who have stood in this same place many times already. Nobody knows exactly when the carts will arrive, but everyone understands that arriving late is a dangerous gamble. Food distribution teaches discipline quickly. Rome learns this lesson centuries earlier than many later states. A city this large cannot survive without organized grain movement. Private markets alone cannot stabilize supply for hundreds of thousands of citizens living inside dense urban districts. The empire therefore builds systems around storage, transport, registration, and controlled release. These systems become the emotional center of urban life, not the speeches, not laws, but food. A frightened population still functions if bread remains available. Remove predictable food access and every other layer of authority begins weakening almost immediately. Roman administrators know this well because they have watched crowds react to shortages repeatedly across generations. Hungry citizens become politically inventive, so relief systems expand aggressively during unstable periods. You begin noticing how carefully organized the distribution points appear. Guards supervise access routes. Clerks verify names and eligibility. Labour crews unload sacks under direct observation, while supervisors record quantities on tablets already crowded with calculations. Nothing is casual anymore. Every measurement matters because shortages create suspicion rapidly. Missing grain may indicate theft, corruption, transport failure, hoarding, or administrative incompetence. Officials fear all five possibilities equally because each one threatens confidence in the system. The grain itself, therefore, becomes symbolic. A successful distribution does more than feed people. It demonstrates functionality. Citizens watching carts arrive on schedule see proof that roads still operate, warehouses still function, labour systems still coordinate, and officials still maintain control over movement through the city. Bread becomes administrative reassurance. You also notice how dependent ordinary citizens already are on these structures long before the crisis fully intensifies. Many urban residents possess little food storage capacity inside crowded apartment housing. Daily survival relies heavily on regular access to markets, bakeries, and state-supported grain systems. This dependence changes the relationship between citizens and authority. A farmer producing his own food may resent government oversight differently than an urban labourer waiting in a grain line. Dense cities naturally create reliance on centralized organization because individuals cannot independently secure every necessity within crowded environments. Rome understands this deeply. The state feeds populations partly because fed populations remain governable. That principle becomes even clearer during unstable periods. Distribution schedules tighten. Inventories receive heavier security. Registration systems become more important because officials need to determine who receives aid first if shortages worsen. Documentation expands alongside dependency. Citizens now require proof. Proof of residence, proof of eligibility, proof of registration. Clerks become gatekeepers standing between households and reliable food access. Their tablets matter enormously because names recorded properly receive grain, while names missing from lists create desperate complications. Civilization eventually turns almost everything into paperwork, even hunger. You begin seeing citizens adapting behavior around these systems carefully. People protect registration documents more seriously now. Families monitor distribution announcements closely. Neighbors exchange information about changing schedules, ration quantities, and inspection procedures. Daily conversation narrows toward logistics. Which district received grain yesterday? Which warehouse reported shortages? Which routes remain delayed? Which officials appear competent? The city increasingly organizes emotional stability around predictable delivery. That predictability requires visible order at distribution points themselves. Crowds waiting for food can become dangerous very quickly if confusion spreads. Rome therefore structures movement carefully. Lines form in controlled patterns. Guards separate disputes before they escalate. Clerks maintain measured pacing during verification. Laborers unload carts methodically under supervision. Everything aims toward calm repetition. A well-managed grain line feels strangely quiet despite the number of people involved. Citizens understand instinctively that disorder threatens the entire process. If panic interrupts distribution, everyone suffers. So obedience becomes practical, not ideological necessarily, but practical. One must wait properly, present documents properly, move forward only when instructed, and then leave once finished. The state rewards predictable behavior with continued access. You also notice how relief systems create emotional attachment to authority, even among citizens privately skeptical of government power. A man criticizing officials openly may still depend entirely on state-managed grain access to feed his household. Dependency complicates resistance. That is one reason large governments throughout history invest heavily in relief structures during crisis periods. Aid creates obligation, whether spoken aloud or not. The citizen remembers who delivered food while conditions worsened elsewhere. Rome understands symbolic generosity extremely well. Officials therefore ensure public visibility during major distributions. Magistrates inspect warehouses personally. Supervisors circulate through waiting crowds. Notices explaining upcoming deliveries appear prominently in busy districts. The state wants citizens associating survival with organized authority. At the same time, administrators quietly measure population mood through these systems. Distribution points function as information centers almost accidentally. Officials overhear complaints, rumors, shortages, fears, and neighborhood tensions while supervising relief operations. The grain line becomes a listening post. Again, Rome rarely builds systems for one purpose only. Military presence around relief distribution increases as well, though often subtly. Soldiers guard warehouses, escort supply convoys, and stabilize crowded collection areas. Their visibility discourages theft, while reassuring citizens that shipments will arrive intact. Protection and intimidation blend together naturally in these environments. Most citizens prefer armed supervision over interrupted food access. Fear changes priorities quickly. You can also feel class divisions inside the relief structure itself. Wealthier households rarely stand in public grain lines personally. Servants, clients, or hired workers often handle collection duties instead. Poorer citizens remain physically exposed to the full administrative process. The state interacts most directly with those who depend upon it most heavily. That pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Meanwhile, black markets begin growing quietly along the edges of official systems because shortages always create opportunity. Merchants hoard supplies, middlemen inflate prices, stolen grain circulates through unofficial routes. Administrators respond with heavier enforcement because uncontrolled food trade threatens both stability and legitimacy. The state cannot appear unable to regulate supply, so inspections increase. Warehouse accounting becomes obsessive. Punishments for theft grow harsher. Again, crisis tightens procedural control through necessity and fear simultaneously. The most revealing part of relief systems is how quickly they reorganize social behavior around routine dependency. Citizens begin planning entire days around distribution schedules. Work patterns shift. Household movement changes. Neighborhood activity rises and falls according to food access timing. The city starts breathing through the grain system. And through all of this, Rome continues teaching an important lesson quietly. Stability comes from coordination. Coordination comes from compliance. Compliance keeps the bread arriving. The relationship is rarely stated so directly, but everyone understands it anyway. Because every citizen standing in line watches the same thing happen repeatedly. The carts arrive under guard, the names are checked, the grain gets measured, the crowd remains orderly, the system functions, and once people begin associating obedience with survival, authority settles deeper into daily life than laws alone could ever manage. The guards remain at the gate long after the worst reports stop arriving. At first, citizens assume the soldiers will leave within days. Then weeks pass. The inspections continue. Travelers still answer questions before entering the city. Harbor officials still review manifests with unusual attention. Clerks still update records more frequently than they once did. Nobody announces permanence officially. That is usually not how these things happen. The city simply continues operating through the procedures developed during instability because removing them suddenly feels irresponsible. Administrators argue that caution remains necessary. Conditions may worsen again. Another outbreak could emerge. Supply disruptions might return. Temporary systems begin defending themselves. Rome understands something many governments eventually learn through experience. Emergency structures are easier to build than dismantle. Once officials reorganize movement, reporting, inspection and enforcement around crisis conditions, those systems start producing practical advantages administrators hesitate to surrender. The city now contains more information than before, more records, more checkpoints, more routines for supervision, more familiarity with rapid coordination. From the state's perspective, this feels useful. You notice the change first in public behavior rather than official declarations. Citizens continue adapting themselves around expectations introduced during the crisis. Travelers prepare documents automatically before approaching gates. Merchants expect inventory checks. Crowds organize themselves more quietly around distribution points and administrative spaces. The population internalizes procedure. That internalization matters more than direct enforcement ever could. Rome no longer needs constant visible pressure everywhere because citizens now anticipate oversight instinctively. They understand where inspections occur, how reporting works, which behaviors attract attention, and what routines maintain smooth movement through the city. Control becomes environmental. The physical city appears mostly unchanged. The invisible habits governing it do not. You can feel this especially around administrative timing. During the height of instability, officials accelerated communication systems aggressively. Reports moved faster, inspections occurred more frequently, responses became quicker and more centralized. Afterward, much of that pace remains. Governments rarely choose inefficiency voluntarily once faster systems prove effective. Clerks continue requesting detailed records because detailed records helped maintain order previously. Local supervisors continue submitting regular updates because administrators became accustomed to constant information flow. The emergency reshapes bureaucracy permanently. Citizens adapt alongside it. A merchant who once viewed inspections as occasional interruptions now treats them as ordinary operating conditions. A landlord accustomed to reporting irregularities inside apartment buildings continues doing so because expectations changed during the crisis. Observation becomes normalized. That normalization extends into social behavior as well. Neighbors continue watching one another more carefully even after immediate danger fades. Public suspicion softens but does not disappear entirely. Citizens remember how quickly instability spread through ordinary routines previously. Memory alters conduct. The city becomes psychologically narrower in lasting ways. Not panicked, not openly oppressive, just more aware of supervision. You also notice that military presence inside civilian spaces decreases unevenly rather than disappearing cleanly. Some patrols withdraw, others remain attached to supply routes, warehouses, gates and administrative centers where officials now consider them useful infrastructure. Citizens stop distinguishing clearly between emergency deployment and ordinary security. A soldier guarding grain storage no longer appears exceptional after enough time passes. He simply belongs there now. This is how temporary visibility becomes institutional architecture. The same process affects sanitation enforcement. During the crisis, administrators increased inspection around waste removal, water systems, and public cleanliness because visible order stabilized frightened populations. Afterward, many of those inspection patterns remain intact. Officials continue prioritizing heavily trafficked districts for maintenance oversight. Cleaning crews operate under tighter supervision than before. Market sanitation rules remain stricter because administrators learned visible cleanliness supports public confidence effectively. The city retains the habits developed during instability because those habits produced measurable control. Rome begins trusting management systems more deeply than before. You can see this in documentation especially. Registration systems created for relief distribution continue operating because they now provide useful population information. Travel monitoring procedures remain partially active because they proved administratively valuable. Governments rarely discard mechanisms that increase visibility into public behavior. Even citizens who disliked these systems gradually adapt to them because adaptation consumes less energy than constant resistance. Human beings normalize extraordinary conditions with surprising speed if those conditions remain stable long enough. What once felt intrusive eventually feels procedural. That transformation may be the most important shift of all. The city no longer experiences expanded authority as expansion. It experiences it as routine. The gate inspection becomes part of travel. The registration check becomes part of food access. The patrol becomes part of street life. The report becomes part of administration. Control survives by becoming ordinary. Rome also learns political lessons from the crisis quietly. Administrators identify which districts required heavier supervision, which officials coordinated effectively, which supply systems remained reliable, and which populations complied most predictably under pressure. Emergency periods function as massive institutional rehearsals. The state studies itself while managing the population, and institutions remember successful techniques. Visible activity calms citizens. Fast reporting improves response. Controlled distribution stabilizes crowds. Military logistics strengthens civilian systems. Public ritual reinforces compliance. Inspection discourages disruption. The crisis may end, but the administrative conclusions remain. Meanwhile, ordinary people continue living inside these adjusted structures because daily life leaves little room for abstract political reflection. Laborers return to work, merchants reopen stalled trade routes, families resume routines interrupted by fear. Life moves forward. That movement itself helps solidify the new normal. Citizens born later encounter these systems already embedded into ordinary urban experience. They do not remember the city before expanded inspections, before heavier reporting, and before tighter coordination between relief, military oversight, and public administration. The emergency eventually becomes history. The procedures remain infrastructure. And Rome continues functioning the way large systems often do after surviving instability. Not by returning fully to what existed before, but by absorbing the crisis into itself layer by layer, procedure by procedure, checkpoint by checkpoint, until the mechanisms created during fear no longer look temporary at all. They simply look Roman. The streets grow quieter now. The grain lines have thinned, the torches near the gate burn lower, and somewhere beyond the rooftops another cart rolls slowly through the dark toward a warehouse that never fully closes. Rome settles back into routine carefully, almost cautiously, as if the city itself remembers how quickly order can tighten around ordinary life. In places like this, entire worlds continue not through spectacle but through quiet systems repeated every day by ordinary people. And if you would like to return to the archive again, there will always be another forgotten system waiting in the dark.